Welcome to Conversations on fairobserver.com. This will be a series of discussions about global issues with eminent guests. Today we have Carle, a former Deputy National Intelligence Officer, a man who has had a gloriously successful and eminent career, and a man who is now a celebrated author who's written the book The Interrogator, which has been covered in the New York Times, on the Wall Street Journal, and every media channel imaginable. Today, we will have a conversation with him about the rise, or if you want to take another perspective, the return of China on the global scene. Without further ado, let's start the conversation. Welcome, Glenn. Glenn, how do you see the rise of China, or in other words, the return of China on the global scene playing out for the US and the rest of the world?
It's one of the, even in the years that I was on the National Intelligence Council, which ended in 2007, my tenure, it was the central, or one of the central concerns of the intelligence community and the national security strategic thinking offices, quite legitimately. It won't be a surprise that there was a bifurcation of assessment. The Bush administration on the whole, Republicans on the whole, I'm simplifying a bit, were concerned about a strategic threat. And others, I think the intelligence community as a whole, didn't define it so much as a rising threat, but as a rising power. And it's not the same thing, which didn't necessarily threaten U.S. strategic interests. I think the assessment we came to, and one that I share, is that the world structure is changing. It's no longer basically a unipolar world and will become less and less so. China is and is ever more each day a great power, one of the great powers. This may well be the Chinese century, but that does not necessarily mean it is a threat to the U.S., simply another a change in the international dynamic that we have to adjust to. Those who say adjusting implies decline, I think, are completely wrong. But to adjust to a rising power is a wise thing to do, and the U.S. will have to as China grows stronger.
Glenn, you talked about adjustment. What will be the exact nature of adjustment?
Well, I'll give one concrete example from my time, which is even more salient today in 2011. Some of my colleagues and many American officials and Americans are concerned that China is developing what we call a blue water navy, a global capability of projecting power with its navy. These concerned parties view this as a threat. I personally view it as a natural and organic development of a great power that doesn't, again, necessarily imply unavoidably a threat to U.S. interests. China has a large large coast. It has global interests. It wishes to exert its own, defend and promote its own interests. None of those is by definition a threat to the United States. They are seeking to do what the United States also seeks to do. So I view that as a natural evolution, something that I'm not sanguine about because it implies there will be another power with which to deal. And in a world of limited resources and competing interests, there will be conflict. But viewing it that way, I think, is still fundamentally different than defining it a priori as a threat.
What is your sanguine view of China rising as a world power?
For 30 years and more, the Chinese government has astoundingly successfully so far managed an economic revolution, more fundamental, I think, in the changes to Chinese society and politics and economic structures than the revolution in 1949. And so far, they've done it without collapse. They've absorbed, I forget the figures, it's something like 10 million peasants a year going into the cities. I don't know if that's the correct figure, but millions upon millions. Phenomenal economic growth, which almost inevitably would lead to hyperinflation, collapse, retrenchment, social unrest. All these things still are dangers, but the government has so far managed to avoid that and continue growth, which also has led to the rise of an educated, prosperous middle class, which historically exerts a moderating influence on political activity domestically and internationally.
So Glenn, what is the worrying aspect of this tendency?
I think probably that that tendency combined with a resistance by the ruling elites to accept quickly enough political change could lead to tensions that would either cause serious domestic political and economic strife in China and or what they used to call adventurism before their vocabulary changed on the part of China overseas, and there would be clashes, whether it were with the U.S., whether it were to come over Taiwan or the Straits of Malacca because of energy transportation. Yes, yeah. That would be a bad problem. I don't know if that would be a global problem. That would be particularly bad for the Chinese and the Vietnamese, not necessarily a global crisis. But a global crisis is easy to imagine somehow.
We talked about tensions between Vietnam and China. Now, one of the things that's happening in Asia is exacerbation of tensions. How do you think the rise of China is going to play out within Asia, vis-a-vis its neighboring countries?
Well, as you say, it's almost inevitable, certainly a natural phenomenon for the peripheral powers geographically to become allies in response to the rise of a continental power. I mean, it's right out of Mackinder, and it happens over and over, but it is happening. I think, unfortunately, historically, the peripheral power alliances tend to be at a disadvantage in a strategic, any strategic problem. It's harder to hold a coalition together, coordinated, have the same ends, as well as having geographical challenges. I think these are natural things. I think you touched upon maybe the more important point, though, which is we're focusing on the rise of China, but the rise of India is about as equally destabilizing and central to the coming 50 years. And if not clashes, at least adjustment of spheres of interest and cooperation and rivalry between two ascendant great powers in the same hemisphere will be a challenge.
So here's my question. How do you think China will be assimilated into the global institutional framework? For instance, China could buy out the IMF, but the IMF is still a European club. And so the challenge here, and my question to you is, how do we integrate China into this global institutional framework?
Here I'm relatively pessimistic, unfortunately. I think it's more typical that institutions are unable to evolve and embrace a new geopolitical structure and power distribution than it is that they would be in some way replaced over time. It's inconceivable to me that China not play a substantial role in world economic decisions and affairs, but it's hard for me to imagine the IMF and the World Bank evolving to allow that to happen. So that would imply, since the influence of China and power will grow, that there will be some other solution, extra IMF, extra World Bank. But that would also imply, I think, difficult, stressful transition, but I don't know how it would play out. I have trouble imagining institutions reforming substantially enough to define themselves into some other existence.
How do you think the US and China should manage each other? How should they engage? How should they ensure that the tensions between them do not boil over?
I think the U.S. policies for 30 years have been strategically correct, and they are to involve China progressively and as much as possible in economic reform, market capitalism, the regulation that a successful international economic structure and domestic one require, through bringing China into the World Trade Organization, through pressuring and working with China for it to adhere to the norms to which it is now a signatory, on intellectual property rights or subsidies and so on and so forth. All of those things foster dramatic market reform internally for China, and they also imply the taking root of a society and an economy of law. And if that happens, then power becomes more distributed. That's I think, the strategic objective behind American policy, as well as self-interest, of course, economically. And I subscribe to it. I think that's the right approach to take. And I think arguably it has had a generation and a half of success so far for the U.S. and for China. Politically, I'm not totally a Marxist, so I don't think it totally follows the economic structures. But getting the economic reform right is the primary goal, I think. And then managing political crises, whether it's on Taiwan or the nature of terrorism, on the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur, which they would argue is of no concern to the United States, or relations with India or with Russia. There I'm a pragmatist, and having a grand design, I think, is impossible.
So what should the Chinese do to reassure the rest of the world about their rise?
What should it do for the rest of the world? I think it needs to be aware of the potentially alarming appearance and nature that nationalist rhetoric and behavior has when you represent the second largest economy in the world, the fastest growing economy in the world, and 1/4 of the world's population. And that the Chinese leaders can realize they needn't be defensive and therefore aggressive now. The era of colonialism is long since gone. China isn't threatened with encirclement. Its fundamental interests are impossible to ignore, and China will advance them competently and aggressively, and should realize that they are becoming the 800-pound gorilla in the center of the room now.
Thank you, Glenn, for your time, for a most wonderful conversation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here, and we look forward to seeing you again.